Chapter 34 of The Garden of Eden by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. It was unquestionably a tempting of Providence, but Connor was almost past caring. Far off he heard the neighing of an Eden gray. Ruth, with her bowed head and face covered in her hands, was before him, sobbing, and all that he had come so near to winning, and yet had lost, rushed upon the mind of the gambler. He hardly cared now whether he lived or died. He called to the master of the garden, and David whirled on him with a livid face. Connor walked into the reach of the lion. "I've made my play," he said through his teeth, "and I don't holler because I've lost the big stakes. Now I'm going to give you something to show that I'm not a piker. Some free advice, Dave." "O man of many lies," said David, "peace. For when I hear you, there is a great will come on me to take you by the throat and hear your life go out with a rattle." "A minute ago," said Connor, coolly enough, "I was scared, and I admit it, but I'm past that stage. I've lost too much to care, and now you're going to hear me out to the last damned word." "God of Paul and Matthew," said David, his voice broken with rage, "let temptation be far from me." "You can take it standing or sitting," said Connor, "and be damned to you." The blind fury sent David a long step nearer, but he checked himself even as one hand rose toward Connor. "It is the will of God that you live to be punished hereafter." "No matter about the future. I'm chattering in the present. I'm going to come clean, not because I'm afraid of you, but because I'm going to clear up the girl. Abraham had the cold dope well enough. I came to crook you out of a horse, Dave, my boy, and I did it. But after I got away with the goods, I tried to play hog, and I came back for the rest of the horses." He paused, but David showed no emotion. "You take the punishment very well," admitted Connor. "There's a touch of sporting blood in you, but the trouble is that the good in you has never had a fair chance to come to the top. I came back, and I brought Ruth with me. I'll tell you about her. She's meant to be an honest-to-God woman, the kind that will keep men clean. She's meant for the big-time stuff. And where did I find her? In a J-town, punching a telegraph key. It was all wrong. She was made to spend $100,000 a year. Everything that money buys means a lot to her. I saw that right away. I like her. I did more than like her. I loved her. That makes you flinch under the whip, does it? I don't say I'm worthy of her, but I'm as near to her as you are. I admit I played a rotten part. I went to this girl, all starved the way she was for the velvet touch. I laid my proposition before her. She was to come up here and bamboozle you. She was to knock your eye out and get you clear of the valley with the horses. Then I was going to run those horses on the tracks and make a barrel of coin for all of us. You'd think she'd take on a scheme like that right away, but she didn't. She fought to keep from going crooked until I showed her it was as much to your advantage as it was to ours. Then she decided to come, and she came. I worked my stall, and she worked hers, and she got into the valley. But this voice of yours in the room of silence, why didn't it put you wise to my game? Well, David, I'll tell you why. The voice is the bunk. It's your own thoughts. It's your own hunches. The God you've been worshiping up here is yourself, and in the end you're going to pay hell for doing it. Well, here's the girl in the garden, and everything's going smooth. We have you, and she's about to take you out and show you how to be happy in the world. But then she has to go into your secret room. That's the woman of it. You blame her? Why, you infernal blockhead, you've been making love to her like God Almighty speaking out of a cloud of fire. How could she hear your line of chatter without wanting to find out the secrets that made you the nut you are? Well, we went in and we found out. We found out what? Enough to make the girl see that you're noble, as she calls it. Enough to make me see that you're a simp. You've been chasing bubbles all your life. You're all wrong from the first. Those first 4 birds who started the garden, who were they? There was John, a rich fellow, who hit the high spots, had his life messed up, and was ready to quit. He'd lived enough. Then there was Luke, a gent who had been double-crossed and was sore at the world on general principles. Paul would have been a full-size saint in the old days. He was never meant to live the way other men have to live. And finally, there's a guy who lies in the grass and whistles to a bird, Matthew, a poet, and all poets are nuts. Well, all those fellows were tired of the world, fed up with it. Boil them down, and they come to this. They thought more about the welfare of their souls than they did about the world. Was that square? It wasn't. They left the mothers and fathers, the brothers and sisters, the friends, everything that had brought them into the world and raised them. They go off to take care of themselves. That wasn't bad enough for 'em. They had to go out and pluck you and bring you up with the same rotten hunches. Davy, my boy, do you think a man is made to live by himself? You haven't got fed up with the world. You're no retired high liver. You haven't had a chance to get double-crossed more than once. You're not a crazy poet, and you're a hell of a long ways from being a martyr. I'll tell you what you are. You're a certain number of pounds of husky muscle and bone going to waste up here in the mountains. You've been alone so much that you've got to thinking that your own hunches come from God, and that would spoil any man. Live alone? Bah! You've had more happiness since Ruth came into this valley than you've ever had before or you'll ever have again. Right now you're breaking your heart to take her in your arms and tell her to stop crying, but your pride won't let you. You've tried to make yourself a mystery with your room of silence and all that bunk, but no woman can stand a mystery. They've got to read their husband's letters. You try to bluff her with a lot of fancy words and partly scare her. It's fear that sent the 4 men up here in the first place, fear of the world. And they lived by fear. They scared a lot of poor unfortunate men into coming with them for the sake of their souls, they said, and they kept them here the same way. And they've kept you here by telling you that you'd be damned if you went over the mountains. And you still keep them here the same way. Do you think they stay because they love you? Give them a chance and see if they won't pack up and beat it out for their old homes. Now show me that you're a man and not a fat-headed bluff. Be a man and admit that what you call the voice is just your pride. Be a man and take that girl in your arms and tell her you love her. I've made a mess of things. I've ruined her life, and I want to see you give her a chance to be happy. Because she is not the kind to love more than one man if she lives to be 1,000. Now, David Eden, step out and give yourself a chance. It had been a gallant last stand on the part of Connor, but he was beaten before he finished, and he knew it. Are you done? Said David. I'm through fast enough. It's up to you. Joseph, take this man and his woman out of the Garden of Eden. The last thing that Connor ever saw of David Eden was his back as he closed the door of the room of silence upon himself. The gambler went to Ruth. She was dry-eyed by this time, and there was a peculiar blankness in her expression that went to his heart. Secretly he had hoped that his harangue to David would also be a harangue to the girl and make her see through the master of the garden, but that hope disappeared at once. He stayed a little behind her when they were conducted out of the patio by the grinning Joseph. He helped her gently to her horse, the old gray gelding, and when he was in place on his own horse, with the mule pack behind him, they started for the gate. She had not spoken since they started. At the gate, she moved as if to turn and look back, but controlled the impulse and bowed her head once more. Joseph came beside the gambler and stretched out his great palm. In the center of it was the little ivory ape's head which had brought Connor his entrance into the valley and had won the hatred of the big Negro and had, eventually, ruined all his plans. It was given freely, grinned Joseph, and it is freely returned. Very well. Connor took it and hurled it out of sight along the boulders beyond the gate. The last thing that he saw of the Garden of Eden and its men was that broad grin of Joseph, and then he hurried his horse to overtake Ruth, whose gelding had been plodding steadily along the ravine. He attempted for the first time to speak to her. Only a quitter tries to make up for the harm he's done by apologizing, but I've got to tell you, the one thing in my life I most regret, it isn't tricking David of Eden, but it's doing what I've done to you. Will you believe me when I say that I'd give a lot to undo what I've done?" She only raised her hand to check him and ventured a faint smile of reassurance. It was the smile that hurt Connor to the quick. They left the ravine. They toiled slowly up the difficult trail, and even when they had reached such an altitude that the floor of the valley of the garden was unrolling behind them, the girl never once moved to look back. So, thought Connor, she'll go through the rest of her life with her head down, watching the ground in front of her, and this is my work. He was not a sentimentalist, but a lump was forming in his throat when, at the very crest of the mountain, the girl turned suddenly in her saddle and stopped the gray. "Only makes it worse to stay here," muttered Connor. "Come on, Ruth." But she seemed not to hear him, and there was something in her smile that kept him from speaking again. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of The Garden of Eden by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The room of silence had become to David Eden a chamber of horror. The 4 chairs around him, which had hitherto seemed filled with the ghosts of the first 4 masters of the garden, were now empty to his imagination. In this place, where he had so often found unfailing consolation, unfailing counsel, he was now burdened by the squat, heavy walls and the low ceiling. It was like a prison to him. For all his certainty was gone. "You've made yourself your god," the gambler had said. "Fear made the Garden of Eden. Fear keeps the men in it. Do you think the others stay for love of you?" Benjamin had proved a sinner, no doubt, but there had been a ring of conviction in his words that remained in the mind of David. How could he tell that the man was not right? Certainly, now that he had once doubted the wisdom of that silent voice, the mystery was gone. The room was empty. The holiness had departed from the Garden of Eden with the departing of Ruth. He found himself avoiding the thought of her, for whenever her image rose before him, it was torture. He dared not even inquire into the depression which weighed down his spirits, for he knew that the loss of the girl was the secret of it all. One thing at least was certain. The strong, calming voice, which he had so often heard in the room of silence, no longer dwelt there, and with that in mind he rose and went into the patio. In a corner, screened by a climbing vine, hung a large bell, which had only been rung 4 times in the history of the Garden of Eden, and each time it was for the death of the master. David tore the green away and struck the bell. The brazen voice crowded the patio and pealed far away, and presently the men came. They came in wild-eyed haste, and when they saw David alive before them, they stared at him as if at a ghost. "As it was in the beginning," said David, "when the circle had been formed and hushed, death follows sin. Sin has come into the Garden of Eden, and the voice of God has died out of it. Therefore, the thing for which you have lived here so long is gone. If for love of David you wish to stay, remain. But if your hearts go back to your old homes, return to them. The wagons and the oxen are yours. All the furnishings of the houses are yours. There is also a large store of money in my chest, which Elijah shall divide justly among you. And on your journey Elijah shall lead you, if you go forth, for he is a just man and fit to lead others. Do not answer now, but return to your house and speak to one another. Afterward send one man. If you stay in the garden, he shall tell me. If you depart, I shall bid you farewell through him. Begone." They went out soft-footed, as though the master of the garden had turned into an animal liable to spring on them from behind. He began to pace up and down the patio after a time, rather impatiently. No doubt the foolish old men were holding forth at great length. They were appointing the spokesman, and they were framing the speech which he would make to David, telling of their devotion to him, whether the spirit was gone or remained. They would remain, and Benjamin's prophecy had been that of a spiteful fool. Yet, even if they stayed, how empty the valley would be, how hollow of all pleasure. It was at this point in his thoughts that he heard a sound of singing down the hillside from the house of the servants. First a single, thin, trembling voice, to which others were added until the song was heartened and grew full and strong. It was a song which David had never heard before. It rang and swung with a peculiar happy rhythm, growing shriller as the old men seemed to gather their enthusiasm. The words, sung in a thick dialect, were stranger to David than the tune. But as nearly as he could make out, the song ran as follows. "Oh, Joe, come back from the cold and the stars, for the cows, they has come to the pasture bars, and the little game chickens beginning to crow. Come back to us, Joe, come back to us, Joe." He was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, when he seen my baby Joe in the clover blossoms play. He was walking in the garden, and the dew was on his feet, when he seen my baby Joe, so little and sweet. They was flowers in the garden, roses and such, but the roses and the pansies, they didn't count for much. And he left the clover blossoms for the bees the next day, and the roses and the pansies, but he took Joe away. Oh, Joe, come back from the cold and the stars, for the cows, they has come to the pasture bars, and the little game chicken has started to crow. Come back to us, Joe, come back to us, Joe. He knew their voices, and he knew their songs, but never had David heard his servants sing as they sang this song. Their hymns were strong and pleasant to the ear, but in this old tune there was a melody and a lilt that brought a lump in his throat, and there was a heart to their singing, so that he almost saw them swaying their shoulders to the melody. It was the writing on the wall for David. Out of that song he built a picture of their old lives, the hot sunshine, the dust, and all the things which Matthew had told him of the slaves and their ways before the time of the making of the garden. He waited then, either for their messenger or for another song, but he neither saw the one nor heard the other for a considerable time. An angry pride sustained him in the meantime, in the face of a life alone in the garden. Far off he heard the neighs of the grays in the meadow near the gate, and then the clarion-clear answer of Glani near the house. He was grateful for that sound. All men, it seemed, were traitors to him. Let them go. He would remain contented with the Eden Grays. They would come and go with him like human companions. Better the noble head of Glani near him than the treacherous cunning of Benjamin. He accepted his fate then, not with calm resignation, but with fierce anger against Connor, who had brought this ruin on him, and against the men who were preparing to desert him. He could hear plainly the creaking of the great wains as the oxen were yoked to them, and they were dragged into position to receive the burdens of the property they were to take with them into the outer world. And in the meantime he paced through the patio in one of those silent passions which eat at the heart of a man. He was not aware of the entrance of Elijah. When he saw him, Elijah had fallen on his knees near the entrance to the patio, and every line of his time-dried body expressed the terror of the bearer of bad tidings. David looked at him for a moment in silent rage. "Do you think, Elijah," he said at last, "that I shall be so grieved to know that you and the others will leave me and the Garden of Eden? No, no, for I shall be happier alone. Therefore, speak and be done." "Timeh," began the old man faintly. "You have done that last duty, then, Elijah? Timeh is no longer alive?" "The day is still new, David. Twice I went to Timeh, but each time, when I was about to lead her away, the neighing of Juri troubled me, and my heart failed." "But the third time you remembered my order?" "But the third time there was no third time. When the bell sounded, we gathered. Even the watchers by the gates, Jacob and Isaac, came, and the gate was left unguarded. Timeh was in the pasture near the gate with Juri and—" "They are gone? They have passed through the gate? Call Zacharias and Joseph. Let them mount and follow and bring Juri back with the foal." "Oh, David, my master." "What is it now, Elijah, old stammerer? Of all my servants, none has cost me so much pain. To none shall I say farewell with so little regret. What is it now? Why do you not rise and call them as I bid you? Do you think you are free before you pass the gate?" "David, there are no horses to follow Juri." "What?" The God of John and Paul give me strength to tell you, and give you strength to hear me in patience. When you had spoken, and the servants went back to speak of the strange things you had said, some of them spoke of the old days before they heard the call and followed to the garden. And then a song was raised, beginning with Zacharias. Zacharias, echoed David, softly and fiercely, him who I have favored above the others. But while the others sang, I heard a neigh near the gate, and I remembered your order and your judgment of Timnah, and I went sorrowfully to fulfill your will. But near the gate I saw the meadow empty of the horses, and while I stood wondering, I heard a chorus of neighing beyond the gate. There was a great answer just behind me, and I turned and saw Glani racing at full speed. I called to him, but he did not hear, and went on, straight through the pillars of the gate, and disappeared in the ravine beyond. Then I ran to the gate and looked out, but the horses were gone from sight. They have left the garden, and they are free. And happy, said David in a terrible voice. They, too, have only been held by fear and never by love. Let them go. Let all go which is kept here by fear. Why should I care? I am enough by myself. When all is gone and I am alone, the voice shall return and be my companion. It is well. Let every living thing depart. David is enough unto himself. Go, Elijah, and yet pause before you go. He went into his room and came out bearing the heavy chest of money, which he carried to the gate. Go to your brothers and bid them come for the money. It will make them rich enough in the world beyond the mountains. But to me there is need of no money. Silence and peace is my wish. Go, and let me hear their voices no more. Let me not see one face. Ingrates, fools, and traitors. Let them find their old places. I have no regret. Begone. And Elijah, as one under the shadow of a raised whip, skulked from the patio and was gone. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of The Garden of Eden by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The last quiet began for David. He had heard the sounds of departure. He had heard the rumble of the ox-wains begin and go slowly toward the gate with never the sound of a human voice, and he pictured with a grim satisfaction the downcast faces and the frightened, guilty glances as his servants fled, conscious that they were betraying their master. It filled him with a sort of sulky content which was more painful than sorrow. But before the sound of the wagons died out, the wind blew back from the gate of the garden a thin, joyous chorus of singing voices. They were leaving him with songs. He was incredulous for a time. He felt first a great regret that he had let them go. Then, in an overwhelming wave of righteousness, he determined to dismiss them from his mind. They were gone, but worse still, the horses were gone, and the valley around him was empty. He remembered the dying prophecy of Abraham, now as the stern Elijah had repeated it. He had let the world into the garden, and the tide of the world's life, receding, would take all the life of the garden away beyond the mountains among other men. The feeling that Connor had been right beset him, that the first four masters had been wrong, and that they had raised David in error. Yet his pride still upheld him. That day he went resolutely about the routine. He was not hungry, but when the time came he went into the big kitchen and prepared food. It was a place of much noise. The great copper kettles chimed and murmured whenever he touched them, and they spoke to him of the servants who were gone. Half of his bitterness had already left him, and he could remember those days in his childhood when Abraham had told him tales, and Zacharias had taught him how to ride at the price of many a tumble from the lofty back of the gentle old mare. Yet he set the food on the table in the patio and ate it with steady resolution. Then he returned to the big kitchen and cleaned the dishes. It was the late afternoon now, the time when the sunlight becomes yellow and loses its heat, and the heavy blue shadow sloped across the patio. A quiet time. Now and again he found that he was tense with waiting for sounds in the wind of the servants returning for the night from the fields, and the shrill whinny of the colts coming back from pastures to the paddocks. But he remembered what had happened and made himself relax. There was a great dread before him. Finally he realized that it was the coming of the night, and he went into the room of silence for the last time to find consolation. The book of Matthew had always been a means of bringing the consolation and counsel of the voice, but when he opened the book he could only think of the girl as she must have leaned above it. How had she read? With a smile of mockery or with tears? He closed the book, but still she was with him. It seemed that when he turned in the chair he must find her waiting behind him, and he found himself growing tense with expectation, his heart beating rapidly. Out of the room of silence he fled as if a curse lived in it, and without following any conscious direction he went to the room of Ruth. The fragrance had left the wild flowers, and the great golden blossoms at the window hung thin and limp, the bell lips hanging close together, the color faded to a dim yellow. The green things must be taken away before they molded. He raised his hand to tear down the transplanted vine, but his fingers fell away from it. To remove it was to destroy the last trace of her. She had seen these flowers. On account of them she had smiled at him with tears of happiness in her eyes. The skin of the mountain lion on the floor was still rumpled where her foot had fallen, and he could see the indistinct outline where the heel of her shoe had pressed. He avoided that place when he stepped back, and turning, he saw her bed. The dappled deerskin lay crumpled back where her hand had tossed it as she rose that morning, and in the blankets was the distinct outline of her body. He knew where her body had pressed, and there was the hollow made by her head in the pillow. Something snapped in the heart of David. The sustaining pride which had kept his head high all day slipped from him like the strength of the runner when he crosses the mark. David fell upon his knees and buried his face where her head had lain, and his arms curved as though around her body. Connor had been right. He had made himself his God, and this was the punishment. The mildness of a new humility came to him in the agony of his grief. He found that he could pray, not the proud prayers of the old days when David talked as an equal to the voice, but that most ancient prayer of sinners, O Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. At the moment the whisper had passed his lips, there was a blessed relief from pain. There was a sound at the window, and turning to it, he saw the head and the arched neck of Glani against the red of the sunset. Glani looking at him with pricked ears. He went to the stallion, incredulous, with steps as short as a child which is afraid, and at his coming Glani whinnied softly. At that the last of David's pride fell from him. He cast his arms around the neck of the stallion and wept with deep sobs that tore his throat, and under the grip of his arms he felt the stallion trembling. He was calmer at length, and he climbed through the window and stood beside Glani under the brilliant sunset sky. "And the others, O Glani," he said, "have they returned likewise? Timeh shall live. I who have judged others so often have been myself judged and found wanting. Timeh shall live. What am I that I should speak of the life or the death of so much as the last bird in the trees? But have they all returned, all my horses?" He whistled that call which every gray knew as a rallying sound, a call that would bring them at a dead gallop with answering neighs. But when the thin sound of the whistle died out, there was no reply. Only Glani had moved away and was looking back to David as if he bid the master follow. "It is so, Glani," said the master. "They have not come back, but you have returned to lead me to them. The woman, the man, the servants, and the horses. But we shall leave the valley walking together. Let the horses go, and the man and the woman and the servants. But we shall go forth together and find the world beyond the mountains." And with his hand tangled in the mane of the stallion, he walked down the road, away from the hill, the house, the lake. He would not look back, for the house on the hill seemed to him a tomb, the monument of the 4 dead men who had made this little kingdom. By the time he reached the gate, the Garden of Eden was awash with the shadows of evening. but the higher mountain tops before him were still rosy with the sunset. He paused at the gate and looked out on them, and when he turned to Glani again, he saw a figure crouched against the base of a rock wall. It was Ruth, weeping, her head fallen into her hands with weariness. Above her stood Glani, his head turned to the master in almost human inquiry. The deep cry of David wakened her. The gentle hands of David raised her to his feet. "You have not come to drive me away again?" "To drive you from the garden? Look back. It is black. It is full of death, and the world and our life is before us. I have been a king in the garden. It is better to be a man among men. All the garden was mine. Now my hands are empty. I bring you nothing, Ruth. Is it enough? Ah, my dear, you are weeping." "With happiness. My heart is breaking with happiness, David." He tipped up her face and held it between his hands. Whatever he saw in the darkness that was gathering, it was enough to make him sigh. Then he raised her to the back of Glani, and the stallion, which had never borne a weight except that of David, stood like a stone. So David went up the valley, holding the hand of Ruth, and looking up to her with laughter in his eyes. And she, with one hand pressed against her breast, laughed back to him, and the great stallion went with his head turned to watch them. "How wonderful are the ways of God," said David. "Through a thief he has taught me wisdom. Through a horse he has taught me faith. And you, O my love, are the key with which he unlocked my heart." And they began to climb the mountain. End of chapter 36. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. End of The Garden of Eden by Max Brand.